On the west side of Fort Worth, Texas, lies the affluent neighborhood of Rivercrest.
The Rivercrest neighborhood is some of the wealthiest people, not only in the city, but in the state and the country. Billionaires who are known all over the world, they live in this neighborhood. It was very low crime. Seldom did you hear on a police scanner any sort of ruckus that would be going on in that neighborhood.
But on March 12, 1992, the community's veneer of safety is shattered when Fort Worth police receive a disturbing 911 call from a Rivercrest residence.
Well, I received a call about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I was told that there was a Signal 11 stabbing.
The dispatcher relays to officers that the caller is the victim's neighbor.
He opened up the door, and to his surprise, it was his neighbor, Jack Koslow. His head and his neck covered in blood. The only other thing that Jack was wearing was a pair of boxer shorts.
He did say that Jack was articulate in talking to him and telling him some people came into the house and I think Karen may be dead.
Police and EMTs arrive on the scene moments later. While one EMT tends to Jack, police rush next door to check on his wife, Karen.
We proceeded up the stairs to the master bedroom. The victim's body was the first thing that my eyes went to. She was partially clothed and lying face down on the floor at the foot of the bed.
All of it, it was just an overwhelming kind of scene, trying to look at it and try to piece this thing together.
Born in 1951, Karen Koslow came from a long line of Texas oil tycoons.
Karen was an oil heiress. When she was younger, her uncle set up a trust fund for her that was a total of $4 million. So she didn't have any financial concerns at all.
When Karen and Jack Koslow met in the early 1980s, both enjoyed successful careers in commercial banking.
Jack was a banker at a big major bank in Fort Worth.
He worked his way up to a management position and was very well liked.
Jack and Karen met at the bank, where Karen also worked.
He was head over heels in love with her.
The couple married in the late 1980s, while their wealth had made them players at the highest levels of Fort Worth's social scene. The Koslows were known for giving back to their community.
They were big patrons of the arts, of the ballet, of the symphony. They helped raise a lot of money for the local children's hospital.
Karen, one year, was the chairman of the Jewel Charity Ball, and that's no small accomplishment in upper society in Fort Worth.
At their sprawling brick house in the esteemed neighborhood of Rivercrest, the couple had also helped raise Jack's adopted daughter, Kristi, from his previous marriage.
Jack, he had first married his first wife, Paula, and they adopted a little girl, Kristi Ann Koslow. Jack and Paula were married for several years, but when Kristi was 6, they got divorced. Kristi and her mom, Paula, only lived a half-mile away. They lived in a very nice upper-middle-class neighborhood.
Kristi was in the care of Paula, but visited and stayed with Jack and Karen a lot. She grew up into her teens. She went to a nice school, was paid for by Jack.
By 1990, Jack Koslow decided to retire from the banking industry and pursue a new chapter in his career.
He was planning on buying a ceiling fan company and going into more of a service business than the banking business.
Karen was supportive of her husband's new career goals, and the couple, along with Jack's daughter, seemed to be living the good life. Until the tragic night in March of 1992. Karen Koslow has been found dead in the couple's bedroom. It appears that Jack Koslow has also been wounded but survived and has been rushed to the nearest hospital.
Jack was quite bloody. His face was covered in blood, his hair matted with blood, blood on his hands. He was swollen. He seemed very groggy, maybe somewhat even incoherent. He was transported to Harris Hospital.
Around 4:45 a.m., homicide investigators arrive at the Koslow's home and try to piece together exactly what happened. They carefully examine Karen's body for possible clues.
We noticed bloody handprints on the back of her t-shirt, indicating that maybe she had been moved. Somebody with bloody hands had grabbed her and either rolled her over or drug her or moved her.
She'd obviously had major trauma to her head area, her face.
When the body was turned over, we could see this horrendous cut to the throat. Her throat was cut severely to the point that I remember thinking it almost decapitated her.
Investigators find more evidence as they survey the rest of the room.
We saw a buck knife lying on the floor that was open still, had a very ornate handle, and was covered in blood. We were obviously suspicious that might be one of the murder weapons.
Inside a nearby hallway closet, police find evidence of ransacking.
There was a rack in there that held several firearms, and drawers that were open, shotgun shells on the floor, blood everywhere in there. Obviously somebody was going through and looking for something in this closet.
Behind the residence, detectives find evidence where the attackers entered the property.
The gate had been pried open. It appeared to be a pry bar because you could see the points of the pry bar embedded into the wood. And there was a little piece of what looked like a latex glove that had been torn off. We saw that the back door had also been pried open using it looked like the same tool.
The first thought when there is a crime in a wealthy household, the police naturally turn to thinking a burglar. That's sensible. These people have a lot of things worth a lot of money.
Coming up, new evidence points to a person of interest.
Whoever did this wanted Karen Koslow dead. But then looking at Jack, we had a lot of questions on how come you're not dead.
And an unexpected tip exposes dark secrets within the Koslow family.
Was he smitten? He was bowled over by her.
They were willing to do whatever it took to get to that end.
In Fort Worth, Texas, investigators are searching the home of wealthy socialites Karen and Jack Koslow after a brutal attack that left Karen dead and Jack fighting for his life. Between the signs of forced entry and the ransacked closet inside the home, it appears that the attack on the Koslows might have been a home burglary gone terribly wrong.
I think anybody under those circumstances would assume they were getting robbed. I mean, they're in a very affluent neighborhood and they're obviously security conscious.
But what had the attackers been looking for?
The rest of the house was normal. I mean, beautiful home and didn't really see anything out of place.
It made no sense. There was no ransacking for jewelry no picking up of valuable items that weren't even hidden.
So there was more going on than just a robbery or home invasion. The entire crime scene was very confusing.
Hoping for answers, detectives head to the hospital around 3 p.m. that afternoon to speak with Jack Koslow. Doctors inform police that, like his wife, Jack had been beaten with a blunt object. His neck had also been cut, but not deep enough to cause a life-threatening injury.
Jack had been talking, but he seemed to be in a confused state about what had happened. He seems very groggy and very confused.
Detectives also get a better look at some of his injuries.
His hands were swollen. There were little angular marks that looked to me and everybody else remarkably like bite marks.
That immediately raised the level of our concern on how did that happen.
When he was confronted about the marks on the back of his hands, he just really didn't have anything to say about it at all.
It was obvious that whoever did this wanted Karen Koslow dead. But then looking at Jack, we had a lot of questions on how come you're not dead? You have her husband who survived it with, on the surface, a lot less injury than what she had. You know, it automatically raises questions.
Detectives ask Jack to walk them through the events leading up to the attack.
Jack said he retired about 10. Karen joined him a little while later.
He went to bed and then was later awakened by what he described was noise downstairs.
Jack said he was awakened by an alarm going off.
Jack says the alarm was quickly followed by a crash and the sound of footsteps running up the stairs.
Jack said these two men kicked open the door, and that's when they ordered him down on the floor and Karen down on the floor.
Jack says both men had guns and flashlights, but it was too dark to get a good look at either of the intruders.
They started beating him with a heavy object.
They hit his wife, they hit him, just back and forth. And at one point, he went unconscious. He was totally unaware of everything that was going on. At some point, he regained consciousness. He is bleary, he's lost blood.
Jack tells detectives that when he woke up, the intruders were gone.
He checked on Karen and couldn't get her to wake up. He grabbed the phone and was trying to dial 911, but because of all the blood in his eyes, he couldn't see.
He staggered over to a neighbor's house directly across the street and woke them up in the middle of the night.
It's a harrowing story, but detectives can't help but be suspicious. They're particularly skeptical of his explanation for why he didn't call 911.
Even when you can't see, you know where the 9 and the 1 are on the telephone. That didn't make a lot of sense to me.
It raised our level of suspicion, there's no doubt about it.
Questions about Jack's story are still hovering over the case the next day when the medical examiner completes Karen's autopsy report.
The medical examiner's report indicated that she was killed from a crushing blow to the throat, which crushed the larynx. She can no longer breathe, swallow. She is gasping and choking. It's a horrible way to die.
As if that wasn't enough, after she was dead, someone slit her throat and even cut her carotid artery. Her head was nearly removed from her neck.
It's heart-wrenching to think what all she went through. Why would someone just butcher a person like that?
So many times there's family violence situations, a sudden rage, a fight, something happens, and it turns into a homicide, and then the killer tries to set up the scene to match his story. We believe that Jack very possibly was involved in it. To obtain some of this evidence, I was required to write search warrants. And in the search warrant, I was required to name a suspect and why we wanted the warrant. And in these affidavits, I named, of course, Jack Koslow.
"24 hours into the investigation of Karen Koslow's brutal murder, police in Fort Worth, Texas, are looking at her husband Jack as a person of interest after he survived the same attack that left her dead.
I thought there were some explanations for some of the evidence that we were seeing that could mean that he was our guy.
To find out more, investigators dig deeper into the Koslow's marriage and learn that the wealth the couple shared came mostly from Karen.
Karen Koslow had a trust fund that was considerable, around $4 million.
That kind of money always raises suspicion. Jack had his own money, but in comparison to hers, it wasn't a fortune.
According to most of their family, the couple's relationship had seemed perfect on the surface for many years. But police learned that not long before her death, Karen had confided to some of her friends that she and Jack were having marital problems.
They had at some point in time gone to some counseling.
Authorities theorized that the expense of Jack's new business venture might have led to some of the tensions between the couple.
Jack actually left the banking industry. He was looking at buying a business that dealt in ceiling fans.
It was going to be a considerable investment.
And that made us look at Jack trying to finance his new business by doing this.
Further incriminating information is revealed when police ask the couple's family about one of the weapons found at the scene.
That knife that was involved in the death of Karen, that was laying on the floor beside her body, belonged to Jack Koslow.
While police continue to investigate, news of the heinous crime leaves many in the community reeling.
Karen Koslow was a very upright citizen who loved her life and loved the people of Fort Worth. It just petrified people that she became the victim of something like this.
People were panicked. All kinds of wild rumors started flying. Certain people were convicting Jack Koslow just based on, news reports that they were hearing and stuff.
4 days after her passing, Karen Koslow is laid to rest.
Jack Koslow left the hospital on March 16th to attend his wife's funeral and assume the position of pallbearer. Some people were absolutely outraged. They had already become convinced that he was responsible for his wife's death. Some people, even not sure of his guilt, still thought that with that question mark hanging over his head, he had no right to attend the funeral.
Eager to stamp out the rumors and defend her father, Jack's 17-year-old daughter, Kristi Koslow, holds an impromptu press conference on the front yard of the family home.
She talked very fondly about her dad. She talked very fondly about Karen. She said unequivocally that her dad couldn't have done this. She couldn't imagine who did it, and just had nothing but praise and affection for Dad and for her stepmother. She did reach out and encouraged anyone with information about the case to contact authorities.
On March 18th, detectives meet with Jack's ex-wife, Paula, to see if she can shed light on Jack's relationship with Karen. Accompanying Paula to the station is Jack's daughter, Kristi, as well as Kristi's 19-year-old boyfriend, Brian Salter.
Paula and Kristi and Salter came to the office with their attorney, and we talked to them.
Paula tells detectives she wasn't close to her ex-husband or his new wife, but she doesn't think Jack would hurt Karen. Kristi agrees with her mother.
She had no idea about whether it would have been a robbery or something, but she suspected that because everybody loved her dad and her stepmom.
Detectives ask Brian if he knew Jack and Karen. He tells them he'd met them a few times since he and Kristi started dating 4 months earlier.
Brian and Kristi were just members of the same social circle. They knew each other from young people that they hung out with and such.
Brian came from a very middle-class background, and he was more of the unassuming, quiet type.
He hadn't been exposed to the kind of affluence in Jack Koslow's house, and he was dazzled by it. And it added to the glamour that he saw in Kristi.
Brian says the Koslows had always been kind to him. Like Kristi, he has no idea who would do this to them. While investigators work diligently to gather evidence for the next week, they continue to receive concerned calls from the community.
There was never a point in time when we had decided to arrest Jack Koslow. There was never a point in time where anybody said, we need to arrest him, let's get a warrant to arrest him. He was a suspicious person that we had to clear.
But on March 24th, nearly 2 weeks after the crime, a man calls investigators with information that completely changes the direction of the case.
He said, I really need to talk to you. I know what happened. I asked him where he was, and he gave me an address, and I said, I'll be right there. And I jumped in the car and drove out there and met him.
The caller is a 20-year-old man named Paul Carrillo, and he says he knows who killed Karen Koslow.
Paul was friends with this guy, Jeffrey Dillingham. Jeffrey had told Paul that he had committed a murder. He had been involved in something that was very dark, and he needed to cover it up.
He sat there with me and told me about Jeffrey Dillingham, how this guy had come to him and confessed to him.
He actually had physical evidence that he had been given by Jeffrey Dillingham and asked to dispose of it, but he had kept it.
Paul Carrillo gave us a backpack which contained several items. We got Jack Koslow's wallet, which had his ID and business card, a bulletproof vest.
Also inside the backpack is a bag of bloody clothes, as well as an 18-inch metal pry bar. The same pry bar police believe was used to break into the home.
There was blood on the crowbar that turned out to have very high evidentiary value.
But why would 19-year-old Jeffrey Dillingham target the Koslows? According to Paul Carrillo, Jeffrey had an accomplice who knew the couple.
He had gone into the house with Brian Salter.
Detectives recognize Brian Salter as Kristi Koslow's boyfriend. But what could possibly motivate Brian to hurt Kristi's father and stepmother?
It was just another bizarre chapter to this whole investigation.
Coming up, detectives confront Brian Salter and Jeffrey Dillingham.
They expect this is going to be a tough interrogation.
But what one of the new suspects reveals leaves police stunned.
He dropped a bombshell that they did not see coming.
It shocked everybody.
Ever since Karen Koslow's body was found on the floor of her master bedroom, the primary person of interest in her murder has been her husband, Jack. But 12 days into the investigation, Jack is ruled out when Fort Worth police get a tip that two 19-year-olds, Brian Salter and Jeffrey Dillingham, are the real killers.
Jeffrey Dillingham, I was curious about his criminal history and found out very quickly he'd never been arrested for anything. Salter, that guy was so weak acting, I didn't think that guy could do anything to anybody.
In fact, both teenagers had excelled as honor roll students in high school.
Brian seemed like he had been a straight-up kind of guy all his life.
Jeffrey had a girlfriend. He was planning on getting married in the summer. He had no record of trouble.
Detectives secure arrest warrants for both Brian Salter and Jeffrey Dillingham. They set their sights on apprehending Jeffrey Dillingham first. Officers head to the video store where the teenager works and take him into custody without incident.
They sat him down and questioned him. They expect this is going to be a tough interrogation. What they didn't expect was that Jeffrey would start cooperating immediately.
According to Jeffrey, he was recruited by his friend Brian Salter to break into the Koslow's house.
They were supposed to kill both Karen and Jack Koslow. When I questioned him about how he hit Karen, as she was on the floor, she rolled over on her side. At one point, he struck her in the throat with the crowbar, which is consistent with what the medical examiner's report showed.
Jeffrey confesses to beating the couple with the pry bar, but that it was Brian who found Jack's buck knife in the couple's bedroom.
At some point in time, Brian Salter then takes the knife they find and uses it to cut Jack's throat and Karen Koslow's throat so severely it almost severs her head. He talked about these things with seemingly no remorse.
But why had the two teenagers targeted the Koslows in the first place? Jeffrey shocks investigators when he explains that the attack hadn't been his or Brian's idea.
He told them that the plot was masterminded by Kristi Koslow.
According to Jeffrey, Kristi told Brian she would inherit millions of dollars if her dad and stepmom were out of the way.
She was going to share that inheritance with Brian and Jeffrey. I think the two of them were going to get $1 million apiece. When we hear that the investigation has shifted and that suddenly Mr. Koslow is not the suspect, Kristi Koslow and her boyfriend and a friend, they're the suspects, just threw everybody in a tizzy.
It was one of the shockers of my career.
Following his confession, police charged Jeffrey Dillingham with murder. They also arrest Kristi Koslow and Brian Salter at their homes.
I personally arrested both of them. I put Brian in the car with me and another detective transported Kristi from that location straight up to our homicide office.
When questioned by detectives, Brian admits to his role in the crime. He says he was willing to do anything to make Kristi happy.
When they started dating, oh my, was he smitten. He was bowled over by her.
She was in charge in the relationship. She called the shots, and he pretty much showed up and jumped when she said jump.
Brian says that Kristi had first brought up the idea of murdering her father and stepmother only a few weeks into their relationship.
She told me to talk to Jeff about doing it. She said that she would pay him. And she told us to plan it. She just said, do it quietly.
She could draw out a map, which she did, of the interior of the residence, show them exactly where they slept.
Brian tells police he and Jeffrey planned to carry out Kristi's plan on the evening of March 12th.
Brian stole the 2 guns from his parents' house, and then he and Jeffrey drove over to Kristi's house.
We had a backpack, leather backpack, latex gloves, my father's 2 guns, and Jeff had a pry bar.
Brian says Jeffrey was also wearing a bulletproof vest.
They were concerned that Jack had firearms there in the house, that according to Kristi, kept them up there in the bedroom.
Brian and Jeff came in from the back of the house. There's a little alleyway there. They used an air conditioning unit, hopped up on there to get over the fence.
Jeff pried open the back gate. He pried open the back door. He went upstairs and into their bedroom as I entered the alarm code, which I had gotten from Kristi.
Brian says it was Jeffrey Dillingham who kicked in the Koslow's bedroom door.
By the time I was finished punching in the code, Jeff was already up the stairs in the bedroom and had them on the floor. He told me to go listen for noises, and I walked out into the hall.
Jeffrey Dillingham has the pry bar, and he starts striking both Jack and Karen Koslow.
I turned around and I saw him swing the pry bar.
While Jeff is brutalizing Jack and Karen, Brian is rummaging through drawers looking for some easy money, some ready cash.
You know who got that laugh out? Jeff.
Did you see him with it?
No, I did not see him with it. He totally was it.
Jeffrey claimed Brian retrieved the knife and ended up cutting Karen's throat. But now Brian said Jeffrey Dillingham had done it.
It's clear that Brian Salter and Jeffrey Dillingham are trying to pin the murders on each other. The only parts of their story they agree on is that the crime's mastermind was Kristi Koslow. But what will she say when confronted by police?
I went in and sat down with her, and I told her, you need to tell me the truth, everything you know.
Fort Worth, Texas police have arrested 3 suspects for the deadly attack that took the life of Karen Koslow and left her husband Jack severely injured. 19-year-olds Jeffrey Dillingham and Brian Salter have confessed to their roles in the crime. Now police are ready to question the purported mastermind, Jack Koslow's 17-year-old daughter, Kristi.
Kristi Koslow admitted she hated Karen and came to hate her dad. She became tearful and stated that she resented Karen Koslow for taking her father away from her mother, Paula.
She also felt she and her mom lost out on some of the nicer things in life, and that they didn't have it as nice as Jack Koslow and Karen Koslow had.
Kristi admits to the murder-for-hire plot, but she tells investigators that she never thought it would turn out this way.
She thought it would be a quick and painless death. She had no idea that it would be this brutal.
But investigators don't buy it.
Kristi felt that she deserved to live a lifestyle that she could only get if her dad and stepmother were dead and she got their money. She thought that somehow she was entitled to that, and she was willing to do whatever it took to get to that end.
But unbeknownst to Kristi, she never stood to inherit even a penny.
During the course of the investigation, I had acquired a copy of Karen Koslow's will. Karen Koslow had expressly eliminated Kristi Koslow from receiving any money in the event of her death. So this plan to kill and to murder her parents was really for nothing. Jack was both angry and sad about Kristi being involved in this. He was furious that she could do something like this and arrange this and take his wife away and destroy his life like she had done.
What he had to go through is unimaginable. First, he loses his wife to murder. He is beaten severely, lucky to get out of it alive. And then he finds out his own child was responsible for this.
That sense of betrayal must feel so overwhelming.
Prosecutors announced the 3 suspects will face the death penalty if convicted. Jeffrey Dillingham is set to go on trial first.
Mr. Dillingham was offered a sentence of life in prison if he would testify against Mr. Salter and Miss Koslow. He turned that down.
In August 1993, a year and a half after Karen's murder, Jeffrey Dillingham's murder trial begins in a Tarrant County courtroom.
The jury got to hear his confession, and the confession said it all. And that was the nail in the coffin for Jeffrey Dillingham.
Jeffrey Dillingham is convicted on all charges. On August 11th, 1993, the 20-year-old is sentenced to death by lethal injection.
He rolled the dice and he lost. The jury looked at the facts of this case and thought it's so horrible that he simply deserved to die for it.
To avoid a similar fate, Brian Salter agrees to plead guilty and testify against his girlfriend.
I think at some point, Brian realized he's been used by Kristi. Kristi saw him nothing more but as a tool to get what she wanted. And that realization made it easy for him to agree to testify against her.
Per his plea deal, Brian Salter receives a life sentence with the possibility of parole in 35 years. Kristi Koslow's trial begins in May of 1994. Despite her previous confession, Kristi pleads not guilty.
Her basic defense was, while I might have discussed this with these 2 guys, they took the ball and ran with it.
But the jury doesn't buy her story. After just 3 hours of deliberations, they find her guilty on all charges.
The question was she going to get a life sentence or was she going to get the death penalty?
On June 30th, 1994, a judge sentences her to life with the possibility of parole in 35 years.
There was surprise that Kristi and Brian both escaped execution. It's especially Kristi, because Kristi was the mastermind of this whole thing.
Brian was such a weak personality, and Kristi was such a forceful, demanding personality. Brian just fell right in line with her. And whatever Kristi wanted, Brian was up for it. He wanted to do anything to please Kristi. And he believed that they're going to be rich and they're going to have nice cars and live in a big house. And that's what it was all about. Brian Salter was a weak person who fell for whatever Kristi told him, and he was willing to go kill people to realize this dream he had.
This is a 17-year-old girl. How in the world she got to the point where she somehow felt that this was the only way to get what she wanted, and she didn't care what happened to everybody else. You know, it was strictly all about her and what she wanted. And Karen and Jack were just in the way, and they were just a means for her to get what she was looking for.
It's such a tragic story. This astounded me. One of the most bizarre cases that I'd ever been involved in. The real tragedy was the death of Karen Koslow and the loss by Jack Koslow of his wife. He was furious that Kristi could do something like this.
There are murder cases that end with an arrest. There are cases that end with a conviction. And then there are cases that seem to disappear into the machinery of time, leaving behind only a missing person report, an unidentified body, an old photograph, or a family that never received an answer. For decades, investigators across the United States were looking at those cases one at a time. A woman found dead in one state. Another woman whose body was never found in another. An unidentified victim discovered beside a road. A death classified as accidental. An overdose. An undetermined cause. Separate files. Separate detectives. Separate jurisdictions. No obvious connection. Then, decades later, one name began appearing again and again. Samuel Little. By the time federal investigators understood the scale of what they were looking at, Little was already an elderly prisoner serving 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. He had already been convicted of 3 murders in California. But behind those convictions was something far larger. In interviews with investigators, Little confessed to 93 murders committed between 1970 and 2005. The FBI eventually confirmed dozens of those confessions and identified him as the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Yet even that shocking number does not fully describe the mystery, because some of the women he described remained unidentified. Some cases remained unmatched. Some bodies had never been recovered, and some families were still waiting for a name. The story did not begin with a federal task force surrounding Little. It began with years of silence. Samuel Little moved through America for decades. He had encounters with police. He was arrested repeatedly. He crossed state lines. He changed locations. He lived a transient life that made it difficult for investigators in one city to see what was happening somewhere hundreds or thousands of miles away. The women who disappeared into his orbit often belonged to communities where disappearances did not always generate national attention. Some were vulnerable. Some lived transient lives themselves. Some struggled with addiction. Some worked in environments where they could vanish without immediately triggering a massive search. Others simply became another unexplained death in an era when forensic technology was far less powerful than it is today. Little exploited that distance between cases. He operated inside the gaps, and those gaps became enormous. For years, the country did not see one pattern. It saw fragments. The crucial breakthrough came decades after some of the killings. In 2012, Little was arrested and extradited to California on a narcotics charge. Los Angeles investigators obtained his DNA. That evidence connected him to 3 unsolved homicides from 1987 and 1989. Suddenly, the man sitting inside a jail cell was no longer simply an elderly offender with a criminal history. He was potentially connected to multiple unsolved murders. In 2013, the Los Angeles Police Department notified the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP. That changed the investigation. VICAP was designed to do something individual police departments could not always do alone. It could compare violent crimes across jurisdictions. It could look for patterns buried inside thousands of separate reports. And when analysts began examining Little's history, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 3 murders became a doorway into something much larger. Little was charged with 3 counts of murder in California. In 2014, he was convicted and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. For many investigations, that might have been the ending. The killer was identified. The killer was imprisoned. The families of 3 victims had answers. But for investigators, the story was only beginning. Because there were questions that the California convictions could not answer. Where had Little been before California? Where had he gone afterward? Who else had crossed paths with him? How many unexplained deaths could be connected to him? And perhaps most importantly, how many victims had never been identified at all? Those questions followed Little into prison. Then came the interviews. In 2018, a Texas Ranger named James Holland began obtaining detailed information from Little. What emerged was extraordinary. Little was not simply admitting responsibility in vague terms. He was describing locations, vehicles, victims, circumstances, cities, years, details about women he claimed to have killed decades earlier. He could remember places where he had lived, roads he had traveled, cars he had driven. He produced drawings of some victims. Investigators compared his statements against old records. The information began creating connections that had been invisible for years. In November 2018, the FBI publicly revealed that Little had confessed to 90 murders and that analysts were working to match those confessions with cases across the country. At that point, authorities had already confirmed dozens, but the number of possible victims was still growing. And then came the number that shocked investigators and the public: 93. The FBI reported in October 2019 that Little had confessed to 93 murders. Investigators believe his confessions were credible, and law enforcement had verified 50 of them at that time, with additional cases still pending confirmation. Little claimed the killings occurred between 1970 and 2005. The FBI noted that many deaths had originally been classified as overdoses, accidents, or undetermined causes. Some victims had never been found. That detail transformed the case from a serial murder investigation into something resembling a national forensic excavation. Every confession became a question. Every question became a file. Every file became a search through decades of forgotten evidence. And behind every file was a human being. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was the uncertainty surrounding the victims' identities. Little could remember faces. He could describe physical characteristics. He could remember where he met some women, but his memory was not perfect. Investigators warned that his recollection of dates was sometimes inaccurate. Clothing details could also be wrong. Yet the FBI cautioned that those inconsistencies did not automatically invalidate the confessions. The larger details could still lead investigators toward a victim whose identity had remained unknown for decades. In Miami, Little described a young transgender woman he remembered as Marianne or Marianne. He said he encountered her around 1971 or 1972. He remembered a bar. He remembered a vehicle. He remembered a route. He described taking her toward an isolated area and said he believed her body was never found. The confession was chilling not only because of the violence, but because of what it represented. Somewhere in the records of Miami's past could be a person who had disappeared without the full truth ever reaching her family. The FBI published the details because investigators believed someone might recognize the description, the circumstances, or the name. In North Little Rock, another memory surfaced. Little described a woman he believed might have been named Ruth. He remembered her appearance. He remembered a yellow vehicle. He remembered being arrested for shoplifting during the period he associated with the killing. That detail mattered because investigators could compare his recollection against actual records. The FBI found that Little had indeed been arrested for shoplifting at a North Little Rock Kroger in April 1994. The confession contained a detail that could be tested against history. And that is how investigators approached the larger mystery. Not by believing every word blindly. Not by dismissing the confession because of an imperfect memory, but by testing the fragments against evidence. Las Vegas produced another fragment. Little described a black woman he said he met in 1993. He remembered the area where he encountered her. He remembered her appearance. He remembered the yellow 1978 Cadillac Eldorado he said he was driving. He described taking her to a motel and later disposing of her body outside the city. Investigators were left with a disturbing possibility. A woman could have vanished in Las Vegas decades earlier, without a body, without a homicide investigation, without anyone knowing that the final moments of her life might have been connected to a man already sitting in prison. Then there were the cases that had no obvious name at all. A woman in Phoenix. A woman in Los Angeles. A woman in Atlanta. A woman in Houston. A woman in New Orleans. A woman in Cincinnati. A woman in Knoxville. A woman in Charleston. The list stretched across the map. California. Florida. Georgia. Illinois. Kentucky. Louisiana. Maryland. Mississippi. Nevada. Ohio. South Carolina. Tennessee. Texas. The geography itself became part of the mystery. Little's crimes did not belong to one city. They did not belong to one police department. They did not even belong to one region. His movements crossed the country, and the victims were scattered across jurisdictions that had rarely had reason to communicate with one another. The map was the first visual indication of the scale. What had once looked like isolated tragedies now resembled a trail running across decades of American history. And that was where the FBI's database became more than a database. It became a bridge. A bridge between old evidence and new technology. Between detectives who had retired and investigators who had never met them. Between unidentified remains and missing person reports. Between a homicide in one decade and a confession in another. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program had existed since 1985, created to help law enforcement identify connections among violent crimes. Its purpose included analyzing homicides, suspected serial offenses, missing persons where foul play was suspected, and unidentified human remains. In the Little investigation, that mission became painfully clear. Information that once lived inside separate filing cabinets could now be compared across jurisdictions. But technology could not answer every question. Sometimes there was no DNA. Sometimes there was no body. Sometimes there was no missing person report. Sometimes there was only a drawing, a memory, a street name, a vehicle, a nickname, a first name that might not even have been correct. And sometimes there was nothing. That was the darkness investigators were confronting. Because finding Samuel Little was only one part of the mission. Finding the women was another. And finding their families was another still. Little died in custody on December 30th, 2020. By then, his imprisonment had ended his ability to commit another murder. But his death did not end the investigation. In fact, it created a new urgency. Investigators could no longer return to him for clarification. They had to work with what he had already said. They had to reconstruct his movements from records. They had to compare his statements against old homicide files, unidentified remains, missing persons, forensic evidence, and memories preserved by people who had been waiting for decades. More than 50 years after the earliest killings attributed to Little, the investigation remains a reminder that time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes it buries it, and sometimes someone eventually starts digging. An old police report can suddenly matter. A forgotten photograph can suddenly matter. A DNA sample can suddenly matter. A family memory can suddenly matter. A woman's nickname, spoken once in a bar decades ago, can suddenly matter. The Samuel Little investigation became a story about the power of connections, but it also became a story about the danger of disconnected systems. For years, information existed. It simply existed in different places. A detective in one state might have known one piece. A medical examiner might have held another. A missing person file might have contained a third. A jail record might have provided a fourth. Nobody necessarily possessed the entire picture. And without the entire picture, the pattern remained invisible. Until VICAP began assembling it. Until investigators began asking the same question across state lines. Until the cold cases began speaking to one another. The most haunting part is that a confession does not automatically restore everything that was lost. A confession can tell investigators what happened. It cannot bring back the person who disappeared. It cannot return the years to a family that spent decades wondering. It cannot replace the photographs that were never taken or the conversations that never happened. And when a victim remains unidentified, even a confession can leave a terrible space in the story. A name is still missing. A grave may still be missing. A family may still be waiting. That is why the Samuel Little case cannot simply be reduced to the number 93. 93 is a number. The investigation is made of people. Women who had names. Women who had voices. Women who had families. Women who had ordinary days before they encountered a man whose crimes would eventually become one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history. And somewhere inside the unresolved cases are stories that may still be waiting for the final piece of evidence. A woman in a photograph. A forgotten report. A recovered set of remains. A DNA match. A witness who remembers something differently after all these years. The FBI's investigation demonstrated what happens when decades of scattered information are finally brought together. But it also revealed something darker. The cases that remain unmatched are not empty spaces. They are unfinished stories. And unfinished stories have a way of surviving. They survive inside old evidence rooms, inside boxes of photographs, inside databases, inside family memories, inside the names of women who disappeared before anyone understood why. The clock has moved forward. The investigators have changed. The technology has changed. The killer is dead. But the questions remain. Who were all of the women Samuel Little claimed to have killed? Which deaths were truly his? Which unidentified remains belong to those confessions? How many cases can still be closed? And how many victims are still waiting for someone to say their names? For more than half a century, the trail seemed scattered beyond recognition. Now the fragments are being assembled. Not perfectly, not quickly, but piece by piece. And that may be the most unsettling truth of all. The story did not end when Samuel Little was imprisoned. It did not end when he confessed. It did not end when the FBI announced the number 93. It did not even end when he died. Because the investigation was never only about Samuel Little. It was about the women he left behind. And as long as one of those women remains unidentified, one case remains unresolved, or one family still waits for an answer, the final page of this story has not yet been written. The first thing investigators had to confront was not the number of murders. It was the silence surrounding the victims. For years, many of the women existed only as fragments inside police records. A name written incorrectly. A nickname entered into a report. A description of clothing. A date that did not quite match. A body discovered near a highway. A woman reported missing and never found. In some cases, there was not even a confirmed connection to homicide. The circumstances had been too uncertain. The evidence had been too old. The technology had not existed. And the people who might have known the truth had moved away, forgotten details, or died themselves. Then Samuel Little began talking. Suddenly, investigators were forced to reopen doors that had been closed for decades. Little's confessions were extraordinary, but they were also difficult to process. He could describe victims from different periods of his life with startling confidence. He recalled faces, places, cars, conversations. He remembered where he had met women and how he had approached them. He described locations where he said he had left bodies. Some details were wrong. Some dates were uncertain. But enough information could be independently tested to make investigators take the remaining statements seriously. The FBI did not simply accept the confessions as fact. Analysts compared them against missing person records, homicide reports, unidentified remains, arrest records, newspaper archives, and information from local police departments. Every detail became something that could either strengthen or weaken the connection. That process was painfully slow. A case from the 1970s might contain only paper records. The original detective might have retired decades earlier. The evidence might have been destroyed according to old retention policies. A witness might have died. A building might no longer exist. A road could have been renamed. A neighborhood could have changed beyond recognition. Even when investigators found a possible match, they still needed to prove that the victim and the confession belonged together. Suspicion was not enough. A name on a list was not enough. A resemblance was not enough. The investigation required evidence. And evidence does not always survive 50 years. Sometimes what survives is a photograph. Sometimes a fingerprint. Sometimes a medical examiner's report. Sometimes a single sentence buried in an old file. And sometimes the only surviving clue is a memory. That made the unidentified victims especially difficult. Little described several women whose bodies, according to him, had never been recovered. Without remains, investigators could not perform DNA testing. Without a body, they could not establish a forensic cause of death. Without a confirmed identity, families could not receive the certainty they had been denied for decades. The confession could point toward an answer, but it could not necessarily finish the investigation. That distinction became central to the work. A confession could open a case. Evidence had to close it. In one of the most haunting aspects of the investigation, Little's own drawings became potential investigative tools. He produced sketches of women he claimed to have killed. The drawings were not photographs. They were memories filtered through decades of time. But investigators believed they might trigger recognition. Someone might see a face and remember a woman who disappeared. Someone might recognize a nickname. Someone might realize that a missing relative had crossed paths with Little in the same city at roughly the same time. In a case where official records were incomplete, a drawing could become the beginning of a new search. Imagine receiving that image decades after a loved one vanished. Imagine staring at a face drawn by the person suspected of killing her. Imagine wondering whether the woman in the drawing could be your sister, your daughter, your mother, your friend. For some families, the investigation offered the possibility of an answer, but it also reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Cold cases have a strange relationship with time. To investigators, 50 years can make a file seem ancient. To a family, the same 50 years can feel like yesterday. The missing person remains permanently fixed at the age they disappeared. The family grows older around an absence that never changes. Birthdays pass. Anniversaries pass. Funerals happen. Children become parents. Parents become grandparents. Yet one person remains trapped in the past. Then a federal investigator calls. And suddenly the past returns. That was one of the consequences of the Little investigation. Every possible match carried two stories at once. There was the criminal investigation, filled with dates, locations, evidence, and forensic analysis. And there was the human story, filled with grief, uncertainty, and decades of unanswered questions. The investigators had to navigate both. They also had to confront the possibility that some cases would never be solved completely. Little's memory was not a perfect recording. He had lived a transient life across multiple decades. He encountered countless people. He traveled through cities and states. He sometimes used aliases. He sometimes remembered events differently from the official records. The longer the timeline became, the harder it was to establish exact dates. A murder he placed in 1 year might have occurred earlier or later. A victim's name might have been a nickname rather than a legal identity. A location might have changed. But investigators learned that the mistakes themselves could sometimes be useful. If Little remembered an arrest near the time of a murder, records could verify whether he had actually been in that city. If he remembered a particular vehicle, investigators could compare that information with his known history. If he described a neighborhood, investigators could determine whether he had lived or traveled there. If he remembered a bar, motel, store, or highway, old maps and records could help reconstruct the geography. Piece by piece, the investigation became a battle between memory and documentation. And documentation had the advantage of being testable. A jail record does not forget. A fingerprint does not forget. A DNA profile does not forget. But people do. That was why modern forensic science became so important. Cases once considered impossible could potentially be revisited with techniques unavailable in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. DNA could provide answers where investigators once had only fingerprints or eyewitness descriptions. Digital databases could compare information across jurisdictions. Missing person records could be searched against unidentified remains. Old evidence could be examined again. The technology had changed. The question was whether enough evidence had survived to use it. This was not merely a technical challenge. It was a race against deterioration, lost evidence, incomplete records, and time itself. Some evidence can survive for decades. Some cannot. And every year that passes makes the difference more important. The FBI's work on the Little cases demonstrated why cold case investigations increasingly depend on collaboration. A local police department may possess the original homicide file. A state agency may hold forensic records. Another jurisdiction may have a missing person report. A federal database may reveal that the same suspect appeared in another state around the same time. None of those pieces alone may solve anything. Together, they can transform a case. That was the power of VICAP. The system allowed investigators to look beyond jurisdictional boundaries. A homicide was no longer necessarily treated as an isolated event. It could become part of a larger pattern. A similar victim profile, a similar location, a similar method, a suspect appearing in the same region. A missing person whose description matched an unidentified body hundreds of miles away. The database could not solve the case by itself, but it could tell investigators where to look. And in the Little investigation, knowing where to look was everything. Because the country was filled with old cases. Files that had once been active were eventually moved into archives. Detectives changed. Departments reorganized. Paper became digital. Names were entered into new systems. Some information was duplicated. Some disappeared. Some was never entered at all. For decades, these cases remained separated by geography and bureaucracy. Samuel Little connected them. Not because investigators had originally known there was a connection, but because the connection was hidden inside him. Once his identity became known, his movements became a map. And that map forced investigators to reconsider old assumptions. A death once classified as an overdose could suddenly look different. A disappearance once considered voluntary could suddenly look suspicious. An unidentified woman once buried without a name could suddenly have a possible history. This is where the investigation became deeply uncomfortable. Because the question was no longer simply, who did Samuel Little kill? The question became, how many deaths had been misunderstood? Every unexplained death carried that possibility. Every unidentified woman became a potential victim. Every forgotten case file became a potential doorway. But investigators also had to be careful. The existence of a confession did not mean every unsolved homicide connected to Little was automatically his. Cold case work requires discipline. Families deserve answers, but they also deserve accurate answers. Investigators cannot replace uncertainty with a convenient theory simply because a case appears to fit. That is why confirmation mattered. A confession could be compelling. A confession combined with independent evidence could be powerful. And a confession supported by forensic evidence could change the status of a case forever. For some victims, that happened. For others, the uncertainty remained. And perhaps the most disturbing category was the woman whose identity was still unknown. There is a particular cruelty in being unidentified after death. The investigation may know that a person existed. It may know where she was found. It may know how she died. It may even know who killed her. Yet the most basic fact can remain missing: her name. Without a name, a death certificate can become a question mark. Without a name, relatives may never know. Without a name, the victim can remain trapped in a database as an unidentified person instead of being restored to the identity she carried throughout her life. The Little investigation forced law enforcement to confront that reality again and again. And the farther investigators went into the past, the more complicated the story became. The women were not statistics. They were individuals who had lives before their final moments. Some had children. Some had siblings. Some had parents who spent years wondering what happened. Some had friends who remembered the last conversation. Some had people who simply stopped seeing them and never understood why. The investigation was therefore not just an effort to establish the past. It was an effort to repair the present. Because when a cold case is solved, the past does not disappear. It changes. The uncertainty becomes knowledge. The question becomes an answer. The missing person becomes a victim. The unidentified remains receive a name. And the family can finally stop asking the same question every year. What happened? That possibility kept investigators moving. Even after Little's death. Even after the headlines faded. Even after the public attention moved elsewhere. Because the cold cases remained. The files remained. The names remained. And somewhere inside those files were clues that had waited longer than anyone expected. A clue overlooked in 1975. A report misfiled in 1982. A photograph never connected to a missing person case. A DNA sample that could not be tested until decades later. A witness who had remained silent. A family member who never knew which agency to contact. The investigation was now a search through time itself. And time, despite everything it had taken away, had not erased everything. It had left fragments. Enough fragments for investigators to begin reconstructing a story that had once seemed impossible to see. Samuel Little was gone, but his victims were still waiting to be found. And in the quiet rooms where cold cases are reopened, investigators continued turning pages, comparing names, studying photographs, examining old evidence, and asking the same question that had haunted these files for decades. Who was she? Because behind every unresolved case was someone who had once been known. Someone had called her by a name. Someone had waited for her to come home. Someone had wondered why the phone stopped ringing. And somewhere, perhaps buried beneath half a century of silence, the answer was still there. The silence surrounding the victims was never empty. It was filled with records, rumors, unanswered calls, photographs, and memories that had survived long after the original investigations disappeared from the headlines. Somewhere inside that silence, investigators were searching for patterns. Not just patterns in Samuel Little's movements, but patterns in the lives of the women he claimed to have encountered. Who were they? Where did they live? Where did they work? Who knew them? Who noticed when they stopped appearing? And perhaps most importantly, why had some of their disappearances failed to trigger the kind of investigation that might have saved them or identified them sooner? Those questions became increasingly important as investigators reviewed the decades covered by Little's confessions. The 1970s were a different investigative era. There were no national DNA databases capable of connecting biological evidence across states. Computerized records were primitive or non-existent. A detective might have information about a suspicious death in one county without knowing that a nearly identical case had occurred hundreds of miles away. Paper files could remain inside local departments for years without anyone outside the agency ever seeing them. If a woman disappeared in one city and another woman was murdered in another state, the two cases might never meet inside the same investigation. Little moved through exactly that kind of environment. He did not need to defeat a national investigative system. There was no national system capable of seeing him. He only had to disappear into the gaps. Those gaps were especially dangerous when victims were people whose disappearances attracted little immediate attention. Some women lived unstable lives. Some moved frequently. Some were estranged from relatives. Some struggled with substance abuse. Some were involved in sex work. Some were simply traveling. When they vanished, the initial assumption could be that they had chosen to leave. That assumption could become fatal. A missing person report might never be filed. A report might be filed, but never connected to a body. A body might be discovered, but never identified. And if there was no body, there might be no homicide investigation at all. That cycle could continue for years, then decades. By the time investigators began revisiting these cases through the lens of Little's confessions, many of the original circumstances had changed beyond recognition. The streets were different. Buildings were gone. Businesses had closed. Witnesses had moved away. Police officers who had worked the original cases were retired. Some were no longer alive. Yet the records remained. Investigators learned to treat those records almost like archaeological evidence. A handwritten note from a detective could contain a detail that had seemed meaningless at the time. A witness statement could reveal that a suspect had been seen near the victim. An old arrest record could establish where Little had been. A newspaper article could provide a photograph or nickname that never appeared in the official database. The past had left fingerprints. Investigators simply had to find them. One of the most important tools was chronology. Little's life could be reconstructed through arrests, incarcerations, residences, travel, relationships, and employment. Investigators could ask whether he was physically capable of committing a particular crime during the period he described. If he was incarcerated in another state, the confession required closer scrutiny. If he was free and known to be traveling through the area, the connection became more plausible. This did not prove murder, but it narrowed the possibilities. Every verified location became another point on the map. Every point on the map created another set of cold cases. And slowly, the map became crowded. The sheer geographical spread was one of the reasons the investigation was so difficult. A local detective might never have considered a suspect who had spent time several states away, but federal investigators could. They could compare information across jurisdictions and recognize that a man arrested in one state might have had a connection to an unexplained death in another. The distance that once protected the killer became evidence against him. Yet even with the map, there were mysteries that refused to move. Some victims could not be identified. Some locations could not be confirmed. Some descriptions were too vague. Some cases had disappeared into the administrative history of local departments. And some names existed only in Little's memory. That created one of the strangest investigative situations imaginable. Detectives were sometimes searching for a person who might never have officially existed in the records. They were searching for a woman whose disappearance might never have been reported. A woman whose body might never have been found. A woman whose real name Little himself might not have known. And yet he remembered her face. For investigators, that meant the search could not be limited to homicide databases. It had to expand into missing persons, unidentified remains, historical newspapers, local archives, and public appeals. The FBI began releasing information about unidentified victims in the hope that someone would recognize the details. Those announcements were not merely attempts to generate publicity. They were investigative instruments. A single person could see a sketch and remember someone they knew 50 years earlier. A relative could recognize a description. A former coworker could identify a nickname. The case could move because somebody remembered. That possibility changed the meaning of time. 50 years did not necessarily mean 50 years of silence. It could mean 50 years of memories waiting for the right question. And sometimes the right question had not been asked before. Consider what happens when investigators return to an old neighborhood. The building where a victim once lived may be gone, but someone may still remember the woman who lived there. An elderly neighbor may recall a car parked outside. A shopkeeper may remember a regular customer. A former bartender may remember a particular night. These memories can appear insignificant until they are placed alongside other evidence. A cold case is often solved not by one dramatic discovery, but by convergence. One small fact supports another. One record confirms a memory. One forensic result eliminates a possibility. One witness fills a gap. Then suddenly the story becomes clearer. That was the kind of work surrounding the little cases. There was no single locked room, no single dramatic piece of evidence that explained everything. There were dozens of investigations moving at different speeds. Some advanced quickly. Some stalled. Some produced answers. Others produced only more questions. And every case carried its own history. Some families had waited for decades. Others had never known that their relative might have been a victim of a serial killer. For them, learning about the little investigation could be devastating. Imagine believing that a relative simply disappeared, then learning years later that investigators had reason to believe she was murdered. There is no easy way to receive information like that. The possibility of an answer can be both comforting and terrifying. For decades, uncertainty can become a strange form of hope. If there is no confirmed death, perhaps there is still a possibility that the missing person survived. A family can cling to that possibility even when the years make it increasingly unlikely. Then an investigation can change everything. The same file that once offered uncertainty may suddenly point toward murder. That is one of the hidden costs of reopening cold cases. Solving a case can hurt, but uncertainty can hurt forever. The investigators working the little cases had to balance both realities. Their goal was not simply to create statistics or increase the number of solved murders. The goal was to establish the truth as accurately as possible. That meant resisting the temptation to force every unexplained death into the same narrative. Samuel Little claimed responsibility for 93 murders. But investigators still had to determine which claims could be verified. That distinction matters. Serial killer confessions can be complicated. A confession can contain genuine knowledge, but it can also contain errors, exaggerations, false memories, or information obtained from outside sources. Investigators therefore needed independent corroboration. They looked for details that Little could not easily have known unless he had actually been involved. A location. A vehicle. A victim description. A specific circumstance. A known event in Little's life. A record placing him in the correct city. The stronger the independent evidence, the stronger the connection. This method transformed the investigation into a massive exercise in verification. And verification takes time. Sometimes years. The public may want a single announcement. Investigators may need months just to locate an old file. They may need additional time to locate evidence. then forensic testing, then comparison, then confirmation, then notification of relatives. Every step matters. Every mistake can have consequences. That is why the story of Samuel Little cannot be understood simply as the story of a criminal who was finally caught. He was caught in 2012, decades after many of the killings investigators attribute to him. The larger story is what happened afterward. The investigation became an attempt to recover victims from the darkness created by decades of fragmented information. And the work continued even after Little could no longer answer questions. His death removed the possibility of another interview. No more corrections. No more additional names. No more drawings. No more locations. The investigators had to work from the evidence already collected. That made every existing clue more valuable. The old interviews became records of their own. The statements had to be preserved. The drawings had to be analyzed. The locations had to be checked. The names had to be compared. The confessions became a kind of map left behind by the killer himself. But a map is only useful if someone can read it. And the map Samuel Little left behind was incomplete. There were missing roads, missing names, missing bodies, missing dates. Investigators could see the outline of the journey, but some destinations remained hidden. That is where the mystery still lives. Not in whether Samuel Little was a serial killer. That question has been answered. The mystery is in the remaining fragments. The women who have not been identified. The cases that have not been conclusively connected. The remains still waiting for names. The families still waiting for certainty. And the records still sitting quietly in archives across the country. A cold case does not announce itself every morning. There is no alarm. No breaking news banner. No crowd outside the police station. Most days, nothing happens. A file sits on a shelf. A database entry remains unchanged. A photograph remains inside a folder. Then one day, an investigator searches the right name. A forensic analyst compares the right sample. A relative submits DNA. A witness remembers something. And suddenly, a case that has been silent for half a century speaks again. That possibility is what keeps cold case investigations alive. Because time can destroy evidence. But time can also create new technology. And sometimes, technology can recover what history failed to preserve. The Samuel Little investigation became one of the clearest examples of that transformation. A case that began with local murders eventually expanded into a national effort involving federal investigators, state agencies, local police departments, forensic specialists, and families searching for answers. The killer had spent decades moving through America. Now investigators were moving backward through his path. Every city became a question. Every year became a clue. Every victim became a story waiting to be restored. And somewhere in that enormous trail, there may still be a woman whose name has not yet been recovered. She may have been missing for 50 years. She may have been buried without identification. Her family may still possess a photograph. Someone may still remember the sound of her voice. Someone may still remember the night she disappeared. And someone somewhere may be holding the one piece of information that investigators have been searching for all this time. The question is whether that piece of information will ever reach them. Because in a case this old, the difference between mystery and resolution can be extraordinarily small. Sometimes it is a name. Sometimes it is a face. Sometimes it is a DNA match. And sometimes it is simply a person finally deciding to speak. The decision to speak can come decades too late, but in a cold case, late does not always mean useless. A witness who remembers a face from 1978 may still possess a detail that no database contains. A relative who kept an old photograph may suddenly recognize the woman investigators have been searching for. A retired officer may remember a report that never made it into a computerized system. And somewhere inside an archive, there may be a piece of paper capable of connecting two lives that investigators once believed had nothing to do with each other. That possibility became one of the driving forces behind the continuing effort to identify the victims connected to Samuel Little. The deeper investigators went, the more they encountered the same disturbing pattern. A woman could disappear without leaving much of a trail. No social media, no digital payment history, no cell phone location data, no automated license plate records, no surveillance network capturing her final movements. The tools investigators now take for granted simply did not exist during much of Little's criminal career. In the 1970s and 1980s, an investigation could depend heavily on witnesses and paperwork. If neither survived, the case could become almost invisible. Little operated during precisely that technological gap. Today, investigators can sometimes reconstruct a person's final hours through digital evidence. Decades ago, they had to reconstruct them through memory. That difference is enormous. A witness might say, "I saw her that night." But what time? What vehicle? Which direction? Who else was there? What was she wearing? Where did she go? Was the witness certain? Was the witness sober? Was the memory recorded correctly? Every answer could change the investigation. And memories decay. That meant investigators reviewing Little's confessions had to be careful with every detail. They were dealing with a suspect whose own memories stretched across decades. He could provide information that appeared remarkably specific, but specificity did not automatically equal accuracy. Investigators had to separate what could be verified from what could not. That process produced one of the most unusual investigative partnerships in the history of American cold cases. Federal analysts worked alongside local detectives who understood the original cases. Texas Ranger James Holland played a major role in obtaining Little's detailed confessions. Other investigators reviewed the information and compared it with records from across the country. The process was collaborative because no single agency possessed all the answers. The killer had crossed jurisdictions. The investigation had to cross them too. That was one reason the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program became so important. VICAP was designed to identify connections among violent crimes that might otherwise remain isolated. In the Little investigation, that function became critical. A case that looked insignificant in one city could become highly significant when compared with another case hundreds of miles away. The similarities did not always involve the exact same circumstances. Sometimes they involved the suspect's movements. Sometimes the victim's description. Sometimes the time period. Sometimes the location. Sometimes a detail so unusual that it demanded another look. The investigators were essentially asking the country to remember. And the country had a lot to remember. For decades, America had accumulated unsolved murders, missing person cases, unidentified remains, and unexplained deaths. Most had nothing to do with Samuel Little. That was the difficulty. Investigators could not assume that every cold case was connected to him. They had to search through a vast ocean of unrelated tragedies while looking for the small number that fit. The task was enormous. The potential reward was equally enormous. If even one unidentified victim could be connected to Little, a family might finally receive an answer. That possibility gave the investigation a human purpose beyond statistics. But the emotional weight was unavoidable. Imagine being the relative of a woman who vanished in the 1970s. For decades, you may have carried the uncertainty. You may have wondered whether she left voluntarily. You may have wondered whether she was alive somewhere. You may have grown old without ever learning what happened. Then, years later, the name Samuel Little appears. Investigators contact you. They ask for information. They ask for photographs. They ask about her friends. They ask where she lived. They ask whether she ever traveled. They ask for DNA. Suddenly, the mystery that had existed quietly inside your family becomes part of a national murder investigation. There is no easy emotional preparation for that moment. The possibility of truth can be frightening. But for many families, uncertainty itself is a form of suffering. A confirmed death is devastating. An unexplained disappearance can be devastating every day. That is why identification matters so much. A name changes the case. A name changes the record. A name allows investigators to reconstruct the victim's life instead of describing her only through physical characteristics. Instead of unidentified female, there can be a person, a daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend, a coworker, someone who existed beyond the moment she died. That restoration of identity is one of the most important purposes of cold case investigation. And in the little investigation, identity was often the hardest thing to recover. Some victims had no bodies. Some had no confirmed missing person reports. Some were known only by nicknames. Some may have been estranged from their families. Some may have lived far from their hometowns. The information was fragmented. Yet fragments can become powerful when placed together. A nickname can connect to a photograph. A photograph can connect to a missing person report. The missing person report can connect to a location. The location can connect to Little's movements. His movements can connect to an arrest. The arrest can confirm his presence in the area. And suddenly, a chain begins to form. This is what makes cold case investigation so different from the investigations people see in movies. There is rarely one dramatic moment when the entire truth becomes obvious. Instead, there are hundreds of small moments. A researcher finds an old newspaper. A detective calls a retired officer. A forensic analyst re-examines evidence. A family member submits DNA. A database produces a possible match. One clue leads to another. The investigation advances by inches. And sometimes it stops. For months. For years. That uncertainty was particularly important in the little cases because the number of potential victims was so large. Investigators had to prioritize cases where enough information existed to establish a credible connection. Some confessions contain more detail than others. Some cases had physical evidence. Others did not. Some victims had clear records. Others seemed to have disappeared almost completely. The cases with no body were among the most difficult. Without remains, there might be no direct forensic confirmation. Without direct confirmation, investigators had to build the case through circumstances. Was Little in the area? Did he know the victim? Did the victim disappear during the period he described? Did he provide details that were not publicly available? Was there an independent record supporting his account? Could another explanation be ruled out? Each question mattered, and each answer could change the status of the case. That is why the phrase confessed must be treated carefully. A confession is not the same thing as a conviction. A confession is not automatically proof. Investigators still have to establish facts. This distinction is especially important when discussing historical crimes. The victims deserve more than a convenient explanation. Their families deserve evidence strong enough to withstand scrutiny. The little investigation, therefore, became an exercise in patience. There were no shortcuts. No matter how shocking the number 93 sounded, investigators could not simply attach that number to 93 unidentified murders and declare the work finished. They had to determine which claims could be verified. That process also revealed something important about the nature of serial murder investigations. The killer's pattern may exist long before anyone recognizes it. The crimes do not become connected merely because the same person committed them. They become connected when someone discovers the connection. That distinction explains why a serial killer can remain unidentified for years. Each victim may belong to a different jurisdiction. Each investigation may have a different detective. Each case may have a different classification. The killer is the only common element, until someone identifies him. Once that happens, the past can change rapidly. Old cases are reopened. Old evidence is examined. Old assumptions are questioned. And investigators begin asking whether the original explanation still makes sense. That was the shadow cast backward by Samuel Little. A case from decades earlier could suddenly become relevant because of something Little said inside a prison interview room. A woman whose death had been treated as unexplained could suddenly become the subject of a homicide investigation. An unidentified body could suddenly have a possible name. And a family could suddenly become part of an investigation that began before many of its members were even born. That is the strange power of a cold case. It allows the past to interrupt the present. Years can pass. Buildings disappear. People age. But the case remains. Waiting. The Samuel Little investigation demonstrated that the most important evidence is not always the newest evidence. Sometimes the breakthrough comes from combining old information with new technology. A decades-old photograph may become useful when matched with a modern database. A forgotten DNA sample may become valuable when testing improves. A handwritten report may become significant when a federal analyst recognizes a pattern. The evidence did not necessarily become stronger. The ability to interpret it became stronger. That is how some cold cases survive. Not because investigators never looked, but because the tools needed to see the answer did not exist yet. And that thought changes the way the Little case is remembered. For decades, many of these women were not part of a single story. They were isolated tragedies. Now investigators could place them inside a broader historical pattern that did not erase the years of uncertainty. It did not undo what happened, but it created the possibility of recognition. And recognition can be the first step toward justice. Still, there was one problem that no database could solve. Some victims might remain unknown forever. Some evidence may have been lost permanently. Some memories may have disappeared with the people who carried them. Some families may never learn what happened. That possibility hangs over every unresolved case. Even when investigators have a strong theory, there can remain a gap between knowing what probably happened and proving it beyond reasonable doubt. That gap can be enormous. And for the families waiting at the other side of it, the difference matters. So the investigation continued. Not with the dramatic urgency of a new murder scene. There was no body discovered that morning. No suspect running from police. No flashing lights outside a house. Instead, there were investigators opening files, analysts reviewing interviews, detectives comparing dates, forensic specialists examining evidence, families searching old photographs. The work was quieter, but the stakes were just as high, because somewhere inside the vast collection of Samuel Little's confessions and America's forgotten cold cases were identities that had not yet been recovered. And the most haunting possibility was not that the evidence was gone. It was that the evidence might still exist, still sitting somewhere, still waiting. A box in an evidence room, a photograph in a family drawer, a report inside an archive, a biological sample preserved for decades, a name written in the margin of an old notebook. One surviving fragment could be enough. That is the cruel mathematics of cold cases. A lifetime can disappear into a few pages. But sometimes a few pages can bring a lifetime back into view. And as investigators continued tracing Samuel Little's movements across the country, the map became more than a record of where a killer had been. It became a map of unanswered grief. Each location represented a woman. Each woman represented a family. Each family represented a question, and each question waited for an answer. The killer's story had been told many times. The number of victims had become famous. His name had become synonymous with one of the most prolific serial murder cases in American history. But the deeper investigators went, the clearer another truth became. The victims were not footnotes in Samuel Little's biography. Samuel Little was a footnote in theirs. Their lives began before him. Their stories were larger than the crimes that ended them. And for investigators still working the unresolved cases, the objective was never simply to complete a list. It was to recover those stories, to put names where there had been numbers, to put identities where there had been descriptions, to put answers where there had been silence. Because after more than 50 years, silence may be all that remains. But silence is not the same as absence. Sometimes, hidden inside it, is the clue that finally brings a forgotten victim home. The map continued to grow, but the investigators understood that a map could never show the full weight of what had happened. A line between two cities represented a journey. A dot on a highway represented a location. A date in a database represented a moment. But behind every coordinate was a human life, and behind every life was a network of people who had once expected that person to come home. That was the reality investigators faced when they reopened cases associated with Samuel Little. They were not simply following a criminal's movements. They were entering the unfinished histories of people who had disappeared decades earlier. The oldest cases were especially difficult. The further investigators traveled backward in time, the less reliable the records became. Names were misspelled. Addresses changed. Paper files deteriorated. Some departments no longer existed in their original form. Evidence had been transferred, archived, or destroyed. A detective who once knew every detail of a case might have retired decades earlier. The institutional memory was fading, but the cases themselves had not disappeared. Somewhere, there was still a report. Somewhere, there was still a photograph. Somewhere, someone still remembered. That was enough to keep the search alive. The investigation also revealed how differently missing women were treated in different communities. A disappearance did not always produce the same response. Some cases received immediate attention. Others did not. Some victims had families who could pressure authorities for answers. Others had nobody with the resources or knowledge to keep demanding that the case remain active. The result was a dangerous imbalance. The women who disappeared most quietly could remain invisible the longest. That mattered enormously in the Little investigation, because a serial killer does not need every victim to be invisible. He only needs enough of them to disappear without creating a connection. Little's movements exposed that weakness. He traveled. He crossed state lines. He entered cities where nobody knew his history. He could meet someone in one jurisdiction and leave before anyone recognized that he might be connected to another death elsewhere. There was no nationwide warning system capable of tracking that pattern in real time. So the pattern remained hidden. Years later, investigators were reconstructing it backward. The process required something more than technology. It required skepticism. A detective reviewing a confession had to ask what could be independently confirmed. A forensic analyst had to distinguish genuine evidence from coincidence. A historian might need to establish whether a location existed at the time Little described. A missing person investigator might compare an old photograph against a description that was decades old. The work could be painfully methodical. But that method mattered. The investigators were dealing with victims who had already been failed by time. They could not afford to fail them again through careless conclusions. One of the most important lessons from the case was that the identity of a victim can sometimes remain hidden even when the circumstances of death are partially understood. An unidentified woman can have a cause of death. She can have a location. She can have a physical description. She can even have a suspected killer. Yet without a name, the case remains incomplete. The name is what connects the victim back to her life. That is why unidentified remains became such an important part of the broader investigation into Little's victims. Investigators could compare descriptions and circumstances, but the ultimate goal was identification. DNA offered possibilities that earlier generations of detectives never had. A sample preserved for years could potentially become a bridge between generations. A relative could provide DNA decades after the disappearance. A database could reveal a familial connection. A body buried under an unknown designation could finally be associated with a missing person report. When that happens, the case changes instantly. The unidentified person becomes someone. The record changes. The family is notified. The investigation gains a direction. But not every case has preserved DNA. Not every family can be located. Not every victim has surviving relatives. And not every body was ever recovered. That last category remains among the most haunting. A confession can indicate that a woman was killed. But if her body was never found, investigators cannot simply point to a grave and say the case is complete. There is still a physical absence. There is still a family without a place to visit. There is still a question about where she was left. And sometimes, even when investigators know the general area, the landscape has changed beyond recognition. A field becomes a neighborhood. A vacant lot becomes a shopping center. A roadside becomes a highway. A building disappears. The physical world erases its own evidence. That is why old maps can become important. Investigators may need to reconstruct what a location looked like decades earlier. A place that seems completely different today may once have been isolated. A road that now carries thousands of vehicles may once have been nearly empty. A motel may have disappeared. A bar may have closed. A neighborhood may have been transformed. Little's memories existed in that changing landscape. Investigators had to translate them. They had to understand not only where he said he had been, but what those places looked like when he was there. That could determine whether a confession was plausible. It could also reveal where investigators should search. The work became a strange mixture of criminal investigation and historical reconstruction. The past had to be rebuilt before the crime could be understood. And sometimes, rebuilding the past meant finding people who remembered it. Retired police officers, former employees, old neighbors, family members, people who had once lived in neighborhoods that no longer looked the same. A single conversation could reopen a door that had been closed for decades. But conversations could also reveal how much had been forgotten. That is one of the hardest realities of cold cases. The people who know the answers are often aging at the same time as the evidence. A witness who was 25 in 1975 may be 76 today. A detective who investigated a disappearance at 30 may now be retired. A parent who filed a missing person report may no longer be alive. Every year changes the investigation. Every year removes some people who might have known something. That makes time both the enemy and the opportunity. New technology improves. Human memory fades. The balance is constantly shifting. And the little investigation existed directly on that boundary. Modern forensic methods could uncover things that old investigators could never have seen. But modern investigators could never recreate a conversation that had been forgotten. That is why old evidence had to be preserved. Even evidence that once seemed useless could become valuable later. A biological sample. A fingerprint card. A photograph. A piece of clothing. A dental record. A handwritten description. A police sketch. The technology of one generation may be inadequate. The technology of another may turn the same object into a breakthrough. That possibility is one reason investigators continue to revisit cold cases. The evidence may not have changed. The science has. And sometimes that is enough. The Samuel Little investigation became a powerful example of this principle because his confessions created new reasons to examine evidence that had previously seemed unrelated. A case that had remained dormant for decades suddenly had a potential suspect. That changed the investigative question. Before Little was identified, investigators might ask, who killed her? After Little's confession, they could ask, could this be the woman he described? That is a completely different investigation. The suspect provides a framework. The framework directs the search, and the search can reveal evidence that had been overlooked. Still, investigators had to remain aware of the danger of confirmation bias. Once a suspect becomes known, it is tempting to interpret every clue as supporting that suspect. But a responsible investigation must also ask what contradicts the theory. Could Little have been somewhere else? Does the timeline fit? Does the victim description match? Are there independent witnesses? Is there forensic evidence? Are there alternative suspects? These questions protect the integrity of the investigation. They also protect the victims. Because solving a case incorrectly is not justice. It simply creates another unanswered question. That is why the confirmed cases matter so much. They demonstrate that the investigation was not based solely on a sensational confession. Investigators were able to establish connections between Little and specific murders through independent evidence. The California cases were especially significant because DNA evidence helped identify Little as the person responsible for 3 murders committed in Los Angeles County. Those convictions ultimately put him behind bars for the remainder of his life. But those convictions also created the opportunity for investigators to ask what else he might know, and what else he might have done. That question opened a door nobody could have anticipated. Once investigators began talking to Little, the scale of the potential crime became apparent. 93 confessions. Decades of activity. Multiple states. Numerous victims. A trail that stretched across American history. Yet the number itself could create another danger. It could overshadow the individuals. The public hears 93. Investigators see 93 separate stories. 93 possible crime scenes. 93 families. 93 investigations. And perhaps more. That is why the number should never be treated as the end of the story. It is the beginning of a much larger question. Who were they? The FBI's public appeals were designed to help answer that question. By releasing information about unidentified victims and suspected cases, investigators gave the public an opportunity to participate in the search. A person watching from home might recognize a detail. A family member might realize that an old disappearance suddenly fits. Someone might remember a nickname that appeared nowhere in official records. That is the strange power of public memory. Law enforcement has databases. Families have memories. Sometimes the answer exists only when the two meet. The same principle applies to genealogy and DNA. A missing person can remain unidentified for decades because there is no direct comparison. Then a relative submits DNA for an entirely different reason. Suddenly, a potential connection appears. The science can reveal a relationship that no investigator could have discovered through paperwork alone. This is why the future of cold case investigation increasingly depends on combining traditional detective work with modern forensic science. But even the best technology cannot restore evidence that no longer exists. Some mysteries will remain mysteries. That is the painful reality. There are cases where investigators may believe they know what happened but cannot prove it. There are cases where a victim may never be identified. There are cases where the final location of remains may never be discovered. There are cases where the only person who knew the truth is dead. And there are cases where the evidence was destroyed before anyone realized its importance. Those cases remain open questions. The Little investigation cannot erase that uncertainty. It can only reduce it, piece by piece, case by case, victim by victim. That is why the work continues. Not because investigators expect every mystery to end with a dramatic revelation, but because one more answer is still worth pursuing. One more name. One more family. One more grave. One more case removed from the list of unknowns. And somewhere beneath all the statistics, all the databases, all the forensic reports, there remains the same simple human question. What happened to her? It is a question that may have been asked by a mother in 1972, by a brother in 1981, by a daughter in 1994, by a friend in 2001. Different decades, different cities, different lives. But the same question. The Samuel Little investigation brought many of those questions back into the light. And once a cold case returns to the light, it becomes much harder to ignore. The files are no longer forgotten. The names are no longer merely historical entries. The victims are no longer just unidentified women. They become possibilities. Possibilities of recognition. Possibilities of justice. Possibilities of finally closing a door that has remained open for generations. But the darkness is still there. Some cases remain unresolved. Some victims remain unidentified. Some families still wait. And somewhere, in an old box or a forgotten database, there may be evidence capable of changing everything. The question is whether someone will find it. Because after more than half a century, the trail may be cold. But it is not necessarily gone. The trail was cold, but it was not necessarily gone. That distinction became the quiet heartbeat of the investigation. A cold case does not mean there is no evidence. It means the evidence has failed to produce an answer. Sometimes the answer is hidden inside a piece of information investigators already possess. Sometimes it exists in a place nobody thought to search, and sometimes it has been waiting for technology to catch up with the crime. For the investigators examining the Samuel Little cases, that possibility changed the way they approached the past. They could not afford to assume that an old case was hopeless simply because decades had passed. The passage of time made the investigation harder. It did not make the victims less important. In fact, time sometimes made the work more urgent. The longer a victim remained unidentified, the greater the possibility that the people who knew her would disappear themselves. Parents died. Friends moved. Siblings aged. Neighbors forgot. Records were lost. Entire generations grew up without knowing why a particular name had vanished from the family story. A murder can happen in seconds. The consequences can last for generations. That was the reality investigators encountered repeatedly as they moved through Little's history. His crimes were not confined to one period of American life. They stretched from the early 1970s into the 21st century. The country changed dramatically during those years. Cities expanded. Highways were rebuilt. Neighborhoods disappeared. Technology transformed. Police departments adopted computers. DNA became a central forensic tool. Surveillance caméras multiplied. Databases became interconnected. But the women Little claimed to have killed remained frozen in the years when they disappeared. That created a strange investigative problem. Modern investigators had modern tools, but they were investigating an ancient world. A world of paper maps, payphones, cash transactions, motel registers, handwritten reports, film photographs, local newspapers, and memories. Little understood that world because he had lived through it. He knew how easily a person could disappear. He knew that a woman could leave one city and appear in another without leaving a digital trail behind. He knew that strangers could meet briefly and never encounter each other again. And according to investigators, he exploited those circumstances. The women he targeted were often encountered in transient environments. Bars, streets, roadsides, neighborhoods where strangers came and went. Places where a brief interaction might never be recorded. That made witness identification extremely difficult. A bartender might remember the victim, but not the man she left with. A passerby might remember a vehicle, but not the occupants. A neighbor might remember hearing something, but have no reason to connect it to a murder. A police officer might have spoken with the victim weeks earlier, without realizing that conversation would eventually become part of a homicide investigation. The fragments existed. The connection did not. Until decades later. That was the central challenge. Investigators were not searching for one missing piece. They were searching for the relationship between thousands of pieces. The FBI's involvement allowed information from different jurisdictions to be compared in ways that individual departments could not always manage. A case in Mississippi could be examined alongside one in Florida. A homicide in Texas could be compared with an unidentified woman in California. A missing person report could be reviewed against a confession made decades later in prison. This was the power of centralization. But centralization also exposed how fragmented the original investigations had been. Different jurisdictions recorded information differently. Some used different terminology. Some preserved more evidence than others. Some cases contained detailed reports. Others were remarkably thin. And the women themselves were not always entered into systems in ways that made later comparison easy. A nickname could become a different spelling. A surname could be missing. An age could be wrong. A physical description could vary between reports. A height recorded by one officer could differ from another. These small differences can be devastating to database searches. The computer does not understand that two slightly different descriptions may belong to the same person unless investigators teach it how to make that connection. That is why human judgment remains critical. The investigator must look beyond the exact words, beyond the spelling, beyond the numbers. The question is not simply whether two records are identical. The question is whether they could describe the same person. That process can generate leads. But leads must be tested. And testing takes time. In the little investigation, time was measured not in days, but in decades. Some potential connections went back more than 50 years. That meant investigators were effectively asking modern science to communicate with evidence created before modern science existed. A DNA sample could come from a body discovered in an era when DNA testing was unimaginable. A fingerprint could have been collected on paper decades before automated fingerprint systems became widespread. A photograph could have been taken on film and stored in a physical archive. The evidence was old. The analytical possibilities were new. That combination created opportunities. It also created limitations. DNA can identify, but only if biological material survived. Fingerprints can identify, but only if prints were collected and preserved. Documents can reveal movements, but only if the documents survived. Witnesses can explain circumstances, but only if their memories remain reliable. Every investigative path has a point where time can intervene. That is why some cases will always remain partially unresolved. The investigators understood that. But they also understood something else. A partial answer can still matter. If a victim can be identified, even without recovering her remains, a family may finally learn what happened. If a location can be established, investigators may be able to connect another case. If Little's presence in a city can be verified, a previously unrelated investigation may deserve another look. Every confirmed fact reduces the darkness. And sometimes one confirmed fact can illuminate several cases at once. That is how serial investigations grow. Not in a straight line. They expand outward. One confirmed murder leads to another possible victim. That victim leads to a location. The location leads to another police department. That department produces another report. The report contains another name. The name leads to a missing person case. The missing person case contains a photograph. The photograph resembles a drawing. And suddenly, an investigation that appeared to have reached a dead end begins moving again. The chain can be incredibly fragile. Break one link, and the entire theory may collapse. But preserve enough links and the connection can become undeniable. This was why the FBI's work on Little was so important beyond the individual convictions. It demonstrated the value of looking at violent crime as a connected national phenomenon rather than a collection of isolated local events. Serial killers do not respect county lines. They do not respect state borders. They do not care which police department has jurisdiction. The investigative system has to adapt. Little's case exposed what happens when it does. The same man who had once appeared in one local police file could suddenly be recognized as a suspect in cases scattered across the country. The past was reorganized around a single identity. Samuel Little became the common denominator. But that did not mean every case was his. That distinction remained essential. Investigators had to resist the gravitational pull of a famous suspect. Once a name becomes associated with dozens of murders, every unexplained death can appear suspicious. But investigators needed proof. They needed corroboration. They needed to know that the woman Little described was the woman in the case file. They needed to establish that the crime occurred where and when he said it did. They needed to determine whether other evidence supported the account. That process protected the integrity of the victim's stories. Because the wrong answer can be as damaging as no answer. A family told that their relative was murdered deserves certainty based on evidence, not speculation. A community deserves the truth, not a theory created to satisfy public curiosity. And a victim deserves to be remembered accurately. That principle became especially important as Little's confessions attracted national attention. The number was shocking: 93. It was the kind of number that immediately became a headline. But headlines compress human beings into statistics. Investigators could not. They had to expand the number back into individual stories. One woman, then another, then another. Each with a different life, different relationships, different circumstances, different unanswered questions. That is why the most important part of the investigation was not counting victims. It was identifying them. A name is powerful. A name gives a family something tangible. A name allows records to be corrected. A name allows a grave to be marked. A name allows the victim to be remembered as a person rather than a mystery. That is why the search for unidentified victims continued. And it was not always dramatic. Sometimes the work involved calling another agency. Sometimes searching a newspaper archive. Sometimes examining an old photograph. Sometimes entering a variation of a name into a database. Sometimes waiting for forensic testing. The public rarely sees those moments. There are no flashing lights. No helicopters. No dramatic. Just people working through old information. But those quiet moments can determine whether a case survives. The investigators were also forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Samuel Little had died. There would be no trial for most of the crimes he confessed to. No jury would hear the evidence. No cross-examination would test every statement. For many victims, the judicial process could never unfold in the traditional way. The investigation, therefore, became even more dependent on corroboration. The goal was not merely to believe Little. It was to establish what could be established without him. That distinction became the foundation of the remaining work. The killer's voice could disappear. The evidence had to speak instead. And evidence has its own language. DNA. Records. Dates. Locations. Photographs. Witness statements. Forensic reports. Each piece says something different. The challenge is making them tell the same story. When they do, an old case can suddenly become clear. When they do not, the uncertainty remains. That uncertainty is frustrating. But it is honest. And in cold case investigation, honesty matters. Some mysteries cannot be forced open. Some evidence is simply gone. Some victims may never be found. But the absence of an answer today does not mean an answer is impossible tomorrow. That is perhaps the most important lesson of the little investigation. A case can remain dormant for decades and still contain a future breakthrough. Technology changes. Databases improve. DNA techniques advance. People remember. Families come forward. Records are digitized. Old evidence is rediscovered. The case waits. And then something changes. The Samuel Little investigation began in a world where many of his crimes were separated by geography and time. It continued in a world where those barriers were becoming weaker. But the victims remained at the center. The goal was never simply to understand Samuel Little. It was to understand what happened to the women whose lives intersected with his. That distinction changes the entire story. Because the most important question is not how a serial killer managed to remain hidden. It is how many people disappeared while the world continued moving around them. A city continued operating. Cars continued driving. Bars continued opening. People went to work. Families ate dinner. Children went to school. And somewhere, one woman did not come home. The next morning, someone noticed. Or perhaps nobody did. That is the nightmare hidden inside the cold cases. Not simply the violence. The invisibility. A person can disappear while an entire city keeps moving. Decades later, investigators try to stop that movement long enough to look backward. They search the records. They reconstruct the routes. They examine the evidence. They ask the questions that should perhaps have been asked years earlier. And slowly, the invisible becomes visible. The victim's name emerges. The circumstances become clearer. The connection becomes stronger. The case moves one step closer to closure. But somewhere beyond the confirmed cases, there are still unanswered files. Women whose identities remain uncertain. Women whose remains have not been located. Women whose families may still be waiting. The number of unresolved questions has become smaller. But it has not reached zero. And until it does, the story remains unfinished. Because Samuel Little may be dead. His crimes may belong to another era. His name may eventually become another entry in the history of American criminal justice. But the women he left behind do not belong to history alone. They belong to the people who loved them, to the families who remembered them, to the investigators who kept searching, and to the records that still carry their unanswered questions. More than 50 years can pass. A trail can disappear beneath new roads and new buildings. A witness can forget. A photograph can fade. A file can become brittle. But one fact remains. Someone was there. Someone knew her. Someone remembers. And somewhere in the silence, there may still be enough evidence to bring her name back. Someone remembers. That possibility is what keeps a cold case alive when every conventional lead appears exhausted. A name spoken by an elderly relative. A photograph stored in a box. A letter never thrown away. A police report written before computers transformed law enforcement. These fragments may look insignificant when viewed alone, but in an investigation that stretches across half a century, the smallest surviving detail can become the key to an entire chain of evidence. That was the strange reality of the Samuel Little investigation. The further investigators moved into the past, the more they realized that solving the cases would require them to think differently about what evidence actually meant. Evidence was not always something dramatic. Sometimes it was simply proof that Little had been somewhere at the right time. Sometimes it was a description that matched a missing woman. Sometimes it was a detail from a confession that had never appeared in a newspaper or police report. Sometimes it was the absence of something investigators expected to find. Every possibility had to be tested. Every contradiction had to be examined. And every confirmed fact could lead somewhere else. The investigation became a continuous conversation between the past and the present. Old files were brought back into the light. New technology was applied to old evidence. Investigators who had never met the original detectives inherited their questions. Families who had spent decades with uncertainty were suddenly asked to remember details they had not discussed in years. And at the center of it all was a dead man whose memories had become a map of violence. Samuel Little could no longer be questioned, but his statements remained. Investigators had recordings and interviews. They had drawings. They had descriptions. They had locations. They had the history of a man who had spent decades moving through different parts of the country. The challenge was turning those statements into independently verifiable facts. That process required patience because the passage of time had created contradictions everywhere. Little could remember the victim's appearance, but not her name. He could remember a city, but not an exact street. He could remember a year, but not a month. He could remember a vehicle, but not its precise color. Those imperfections might appear damaging. But investigators understood that memory does not operate like a video recording. A person can remember an event vividly while misremembering its date. A face can remain recognizable while a name disappears. A location can be remembered by landmarks that no longer exist. For that reason, investigators looked for the parts of Little's recollections that could be independently checked. If he said he had been arrested in a particular city, records could establish whether he had. If he described a specific vehicle, investigators could compare it with known information. If he remembered a victim in a particular location, they could examine missing person reports and unidentified remains from that area. If he described circumstances that had never been publicly released, investigators could ask how he knew them. The stronger the independent confirmation, the more seriously the confession could be treated. That methodology mattered because the investigation was too important to depend on belief alone. There were families involved. There were reputations. There were decades of unanswered questions. And there were victims who deserved accuracy. The investigators therefore had to separate three different things: what Little claimed, what the records showed, and what could be proven. Those categories did not always overlap. Sometimes they aligned almost perfectly. Those were the cases that could move forward. Sometimes they partially aligned. Those cases required more work. And sometimes there was not enough evidence to establish a connection. Those cases remained unresolved. That uncertainty was difficult to accept, but it was part of the truth. A cold case cannot be solved simply because everyone wants it solved. Evidence has to survive scrutiny. The investigators knew that. And that was why the process could take so long. Consider the problem of identifying a victim from decades earlier. A missing person report may list an age, but Little may have remembered a different age. A witness may have estimated height. A family photograph may show a different hairstyle. A police sketch may capture only part of a face. A body, if recovered, may have been buried under an unidentified designation. Every piece of information contains uncertainty. Modern investigators must combine them without assuming that any one source is perfect. That is forensic reconstruction. It is less dramatic than the image of a detective discovering a hidden clue. But it is often far more important. The truth emerges through comparison. One record against another. One memory against a document. One DNA profile against another. One timeline against the suspect's movements. The pieces either fit or they do not. And when enough pieces fit, the case begins to change. This process also revealed the importance of historical context. A woman disappearing in 1975 cannot be investigated exactly like a woman disappearing today. The communication systems were different. The transportation systems were different. The social environment was different. The way police classified crimes was different. The way families reported missing relatives was different. Even the language used in police records could be different. Investigators had to understand the era before interpreting its records. That meant looking beyond databases. They had to examine newspapers, court records, jail records, property records, employment histories, old maps, telephone directories, anything that could establish where a person was and what was happening around them. The investigation was becoming a reconstruction of American history through the movements of one man. But that reconstruction always returned to the same question. Where were the women? Some had been identified. Some had been connected to known murders. But others remained uncertain. And the unidentified victims represented perhaps the greatest unfinished responsibility. An unidentified victim has no voice. The investigation must speak for her. That means investigators have to be careful with every conclusion. A description must be preserved. A possible identity must be tested. A family must be contacted carefully. A forensic match must be confirmed. A record must be corrected. The process can take months, sometimes longer. But when it succeeds, the impact can last forever. For a family that has waited decades, the moment of identification can redefine an entire lifetime. The disappearance no longer has to be imagined. The victim is no longer missing from the historical record. There is a name. There is a date. There is a place. There is a story. And perhaps there is finally a grave. That possibility is what gives cold case investigation its extraordinary importance. Justice is not always measured by punishment. Sometimes justice begins with recognition. A victim is recognized. A family is recognized. A forgotten case is recognized. The truth is recognized. That was especially significant in the Little investigation because many of the women had lived on society's margins. Their disappearances did not always generate the same attention as those of people whose lives were more stable or whose families had greater access to law enforcement. That inequality could allow a person to vanish. It could allow a case to remain dormant. And it could allow a serial offender to continue. The investigation therefore raised difficult questions beyond the identity of Samuel Little. How were missing women treated? Which cases received immediate attention? Which cases were overlooked? How did social status influence investigative priorities? And how many cases might have been solved earlier if information had been shared more effectively? Those questions are uncomfortable because they force investigators and the public to examine the systems that existed before modern cold case practices became common. The past cannot be changed, but it can be studied. And the lessons can influence how future cases are handled. The Little investigation demonstrated the danger of fragmented information. One department may hold a homicide report. Another may hold a missing person report. A third may hold an arrest record involving the same suspect. If nobody compares them, the connection remains hidden. Modern systems are designed to make those comparisons easier. But technology alone is not enough. Someone still has to search. Someone still has to notice. Someone still has to ask whether two apparently unrelated cases might actually belong together. That human judgment remains at the center of criminal investigation. And in the Little case, it changed everything. The breakthrough did not come because a machine suddenly announced the entire truth. It came because investigators recognized the significance of a suspect who had already been convicted of 3 murders. They looked deeper. They asked questions. They listened. They compared. They followed leads. The machine helped. The people drove the investigation. That combination became a model for how cold cases can be approached in the modern era. But even now, the work is not finished. Some cases require evidence that may never be recovered. Some victims may remain unidentified. Some families may never receive the certainty they want. And that possibility gives the investigation a different kind of tension. There is no guaranteed ending, no final episode, no moment when every question is answered. A cold case can remain open indefinitely. It can wait for technology. It can wait for information. It can wait for a person to come forward. That is why the passage of time does not necessarily end an investigation. Sometimes it only changes the form of the investigation. In the beginning, detectives may search streets. Later, they search databases. Later still, they search archives. Then they search DNA. Then genealogy. Then memories. The investigation evolves because the evidence evolves. The Samuel Little cases moved through all of those worlds. The crimes began in an era of limited forensic science. The suspect was eventually identified through modern DNA technology. His confessions were then analyzed using national databases and historical records. And the remaining cases continue to depend on forensic science, identification technology, and human memory. It is a story about the transformation of criminal investigation itself. But at its center remains something much simpler. A woman disappeared. Someone wondered where she went. Years passed. And eventually, an investigator opened the file again. That moment may seem ordinary. It is not. Opening an old file is an act of resistance against forgetting. It says that the person inside still matters. It says that the passage of time does not erase responsibility. It says that a case can wait decades and still deserve attention. That is why the Little investigation remains significant even after the killer's death. The investigation is no longer about stopping him. It is about understanding what he left behind. And what he left behind was not merely a criminal record. It was a landscape of unanswered questions. A woman in one city, another in another state, a body without a name, a missing person report without a body, a family without an explanation, a detective without enough evidence, a file without an ending. The work now is to connect those fragments wherever the evidence allows. And when the evidence does not allow it, investigators must preserve the uncertainty rather than invent certainty. That distinction is what separates investigation from storytelling. The truth does not always provide a satisfying ending. Sometimes it provides only a smaller mystery. Sometimes it confirms what happened but not why. Sometimes it identifies the victim but not the location of her remains. Sometimes it establishes the killer but leaves questions about the final moments unanswered. Even so, each answer matters. Because every answer reduces the space occupied by uncertainty. And for families who have lived with that uncertainty for decades, even one answer can be enormous. That is the quiet legacy of the Samuel Little investigation. Not the headline. Not the number. Not the notoriety. The names. The women. The families. The evidence. The investigators who continued searching after the story had faded from public attention. And the possibility that somewhere, still waiting to be recognized, is another fragment capable of changing everything. A photograph. A DNA match. A witness. A forgotten report. A name. The case can sleep for 50 years. But it only takes one discovery to wake it again. And when that happens, the silence that protected the mystery begins to break.